Title: My parents tried to steal my inheritance to fund their golden child's college. Now they're begging me not to press charges after they did this. Hey everyone! Before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. Hey Reddit! Never thought I'd be sharing my story here, but here we are. This one's been sitting with me for a while, and honestly, I'm still processing everything. Writing it out might help, so here we go. I want to start by saying this. I am not my parents' favorite child. As much as it might sound dramatic or even petty, it's the only way to explain how things have always been in my family. Growing up, I always knew my family wasn't like everyone else's. People talk about unconditional love from parents, but honestly, I don't think that was ever in the cards for me. I'm the youngest of 3 siblings. My sister Lisa is 23, my brother Tom is 21, and I just turned 20 last summer. From as far back as I can remember, my parents treated us differently, and not in subtle ways either. Lisa and Tom were the golden kids. Lisa always got straight A's and was the perfect daughter in my parents' eyes. Tom, on the other hand, was the rebel, but still managed to be their favorite. I was just there. I wasn't bad at school, but I wasn't a genius like Lisa. I wasn't causing chaos like Tom, so I guess I just faded into the background. It was clear I wasn't a priority. Birthdays are a perfect example. Lisa and Tom would get big celebrations. Cakes, gifts, balloons, you name it. When it came to me, though, it was usually just a quick, "Oh, happy birthday," while everyone else got on with their day. One year, I remember asking my mom if I could have a small party like Lisa's. She just gave me a look and said, "Maybe next year." Spoiler, next year never came. By the time I hit my teens, I started to realize how much it bothered me. Not because I wanted lavish gifts or attention, but because it felt like I wasn't worth as much to them. I knew I couldn't rely on my parents for support, so when I was 13, I started doing odd jobs around the neighborhood. Mowing lawns, washing cars, stuff like that. I saved every penny, and eventually I managed to buy my own things, like a secondhand laptop for school. Meanwhile, Lisa and Tom got brand new MacBooks handed to them the second they needed one. I tried not to let it get to me. I figured, hey, at least I'm learning to stand on my own 2 feet. But it was hard not to feel bitter sometimes, especially when my parents would make excuses for why they couldn't give me the same opportunities as my siblings. They'd say things like, "Lisa needs it for her classes," or "Tom just needs a little extra help right now." It was always something. The turning point came when I turned 18 and graduated high school. My parents didn't even ask if I wanted to go to college. They just assumed I'd figure it out on my own. Meanwhile, Lisa got full financial support for her studies, and Tom, well, he didn't stick to anything long enough to need support, but they still gave him money whenever he asked. By this point, I had learned not to expect much from them, so I decided to take a gap year after I finished high school and work, while I figured out my next steps. I got a part-time job, paid rent to my parents because I didn't want to be a freeloader, and started saving up for college. It wasn't easy, but it felt good to be independent. Then, later that year, everything changed. My grandfather passed away, and in his will, he left each of us grandkids a chunk of money to help with college or housing. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to make a real difference in my life. I finally felt like I had a shot at something better, until my parents decided to throw a wrench into my plans. The money he left us felt like a small victory for me. For once, I had a safety net. I could afford college without working ridiculous hours or taking out massive loans. It felt like my ticket out of this constant feeling of being overlooked and undervalued. Lisa's share went straight to her tuition. No questions, no drama, just smooth sailing as always. Tom, on the other hand, became the walking definition of a money pit. He started college around the same time, but couldn't stick to a single major for more than a semester. First, it was engineering because he wanted to build cool stuff. Then it was business because that's where the real money's at. After that, it was art because apparently he wanted to find his passion. Each switch cost a fortune, and he burned through his inheritance faster than anyone could have predicted. By the time my parents realized the money was almost gone, Tom was already talking about changing majors again. I remember overhearing my dad say, "Well, at least he's trying," while I was in the kitchen making dinner. I nearly laughed out loud. If that's what trying looks like, then I don't even want to know what failing would be. At first, I thought, not my problem. Both my siblings had already moved out. Lisa had graduated and landed a job in another state, and Tom was supposed to be living in a dorm, though I later found out he'd moved back home after burning through his money. I was the only one left in the house, still paying rent to my parents to avoid being labeled a freeloader. It felt unfair, especially since I was doing everything on my own, while my parents bent over backward for everyone else. Then my parents started dropping hints. It started small, comments about how families should support each other and how Tom just needs a little help to get back on track. I didn't think much of it, until one night, my mom sat me down in the living room. She had this overly sweet tone, the kind she uses when she's about to ask for something big. "We've been thinking," she began. "Tom has had a few setbacks, and he's really struggling to finish school. You're doing so well, and you're so responsible. Would you consider helping him out?" I stared at her, trying to process what she was asking. "Help him out how?" I asked, even though I already knew where this was going. "Well," she said, fidgeting with her hands, "your grandfather left you that money, but maybe you could give it to Tom for now? He'll pay you back once he graduates and gets a good job." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You want me to give him my inheritance? The money that's supposed to help me pay for college?" She nodded like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. "Think of it as an investment in the family. Tom's your brother, and he needs help. He'll return the favor when he's able." I didn't even know what to say at first. It was like all the air had been sucked out of the room. Finally, I managed to respond. "Mom, I haven't even started college yet. If I give him that money, I won't be able to afford it. Why can't he just figure it out himself?" That's when she pulled the guilt trip. "He's your brother, and he's in a tough spot. You're young. You have time to figure things out. He's already behind, and if he can't finish school, it's going to ruin his future." I tried to stay calm, but my frustration was building. "So, I'm supposed to ruin my future instead? That's not fair." Her face hardened and her tone shifted. "Life isn't fair, and sometimes you have to make sacrifices for your family. Tom would do it for you." I almost laughed. Tom wouldn't lift a finger for me if his life depended on it. But I didn't say that. Instead, I stood up and told her, "I'm not giving him my money." End of discussion. She didn't take it well. The next day, my dad cornered me in the kitchen to back her up. "You need to think about the bigger picture," he said. "This isn't just about him, it's about the family." I just shook my head. "If it's about the family, why don't you and Mom help him? Why does it have to come from me?" "We've done everything we can," he replied. "It's your turn to step up." And that's when they dropped the ultimatum. If I didn't agree to give up my inheritance, they were going to raise my rent. They claimed the household expenses had increased since Tom moved back home, and that I should be paying more anyway. "We can't afford to support Tom's studies without your help," Mom said, as if it was my responsibility. "If you're not willing to contribute more, then maybe you need to find somewhere else to live." I was stunned. They were asking me to sacrifice everything I had worked for, and then punishing me for refusing. They wanted me to pay more rent, which they would then use to fund Tom's studies. It felt like a slap in the face. I was already paying more than my fair share, and now they were threatening to kick me out if I didn't fall in line. From that point on, my parents started giving me the silent treatment, only talking to me when they needed something. Tom avoided me altogether, probably because he knew I wasn't going to cave. They thought they could wear me down, but all it did was make me more determined to hold my ground. That money was my chance to get out of this cycle of being overlooked and used. I wasn't about to let them take that away from me. My dad wasn't much better, throwing in his own digs about how I was being selfish and not thinking about the bigger picture. The breaking point came one night during dinner. My mom brought up the rent situation again. "You know," she said, stirring her soup like she was talking about the weather, "it's not fair that we're struggling to keep things afloat while you sit on all that money." I stared at her, my appetite vanishing. "What do you mean struggling? I already pay rent every month, and it's not like Tom's contributing anything." She sighed, as if I was being unreasonable. "Tom is in a tough spot right now. We're trying to help him get back on his feet, but that means we need everyone to pitch in. If you're not willing to share your inheritance, the least you can do is help cover the extra costs." "Extra costs?" I repeated, my voice rising. "So, you're asking me to pay more rent because Tom's living here for free? You're using my rent money to pay for his college, aren't you?" She didn't deny it. "We're doing what we have to do to keep this family together." I couldn't believe it. They were taking my hard-earned money, the money I worked for while juggling school and a part-time job, and funneling it to Tom, the golden child who couldn't stick to a major for more than a semester. "You're not keeping the family together," I snapped. "You're enabling him to keep screwing up while expecting me to clean up his mess." My dad, who had been quiet until now, decided to chime in. "If you don't want to contribute more, then maybe you should think about moving out." I was stunned. I looked at him, then at my mom, hoping one of them would realize how ridiculous this all sounded. But they didn't. They just stared back at me, like they had already made up their minds. "Are you serious?" I asked. You're really going to kick me out because I won't pay for Tom's mistakes? My dad shrugged. You're an adult now. If you don't like the way things are, no one's forcing you to stay. That was it. Tom would always be the priority, no matter how much it cost me, or them. I didn't say another word. I got up from the table, walked to my room, and shut the door. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let them bully me into giving up my inheritance or paying more rent. If they wanted me out, fine. I'd leave. But not before making sure I had a plan. I need to figure out how to handle this well. Now I'm asking you, Reddit. Should I consult a lawyer about protecting my inheritance? If they're willing to kick me out over this, what's to stop them from trying to manipulate their way into accessing my funds? Update 1. After that dinner, I spent the next few days in a haze trying to figure out what to do. Every time I thought I'd found a solution, reality would hit me like a brick wall. Moving out wasn't an option. At least not yet. I didn't have enough saved to cover rent, bills, and tuition. But staying in the house felt impossible. My parents' constant guilt-tripping and Tom's freeloading were wearing me down to the point where I could barely focus on work or planning my future. The idea of consulting a lawyer crossed my mind more than once. I needed to protect my inheritance. If not from outright theft, then at least from being manipulated into giving it up. But lawyers are expensive. I barely had enough money to keep my savings intact and pay rent. The thought of shelling out hundreds, maybe thousands, for legal advice felt completely out of reach. I tried looking up resources online, but everything I read just confused me more. Terms like probate, trustee, and beneficiary rights might as well have been written in another language. The more I researched, the more hopeless it all felt. I wasn't sure how to even start contacting a lawyer, much less how to pay for one. That's when I thought of my best friend, Jake. We've been close since we were kids, practically brothers. Whenever things got bad at home growing up, I'd bike over to Jake's house, no matter the time of day, and he and his parents would take me in without question. His family practically became a second home for me. Even now, Jake's the one person I know I can rely on, no matter what. I vented to Jake about everything that had been happening. He listened without interrupting, which is rare because Jake always has something to say. When I finally finished rambling about the mess with my parents and how I didn't know what to do about my inheritance, he leaned back and gave me this look. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "What do you mean?" I asked. "You know, my brother's a lawyer," he said, like that answered everything. "You should talk to him." It took me a second to process what he was saying. I knew Jake's older brother, Ben, was some kind of lawyer, but I never put two and two together. "I don't know, man," I said. "Lawyers are expensive. I can't afford that right now." Jake rolled his eyes. "First of all, Ben's not going to charge you for some basic advice. He's my brother, and you're practically family. Second, he specializes in stuff like this, wills, estates, inheritance stuff. He'll know what to do." That night, for the first time in weeks, I felt I would finally do things how I wanted. Maybe I didn't have to face this alone. Maybe there was a way to protect what was mine, without ruining myself financially in the process. Now I just have to wait for Jake to get back to me. Do you think talking to a lawyer is the right move, Reddit? Is there anything I should prepare before meeting with him? A few days later, Jake called me with good news. His brother Ben was happy to help and had time to meet me that weekend. I knew this was my best shot at understanding my situation and figuring out how to handle my parents. When I arrived at Ben's office, he greeted me warmly, instantly putting me at ease. After some small talk, I explained everything. My grandfather's inheritance, the pressure from my parents to give it to Tom, the threats to raise my rent, and my concerns about them somehow accessing the money. Ben listened intently, taking notes as I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "You've got quite a situation on your hands," he said. "But the good news is, based on what you've told me, your parents can't touch the inheritance." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. He explained that most inheritances like mine are placed in a trust, and unless my grandfather explicitly granted access to someone else, it's entirely mine. "The trustee is legally bound to follow the instructions in the will," he said. "Unless you've signed something giving someone else access, or they forged something, which is a whole different issue, the money is untouchable by anyone but you," Ben said. "But that doesn't mean they can't make your life difficult in other ways. That's why I'd recommend you start documenting everything. Keep a record of every conversation, every threat, every attempt to pressure you. Write down dates, times, and exactly what was said. If this ever escalates, like them trying to access the trust illegally, you'll need that evidence. It's also good to have a clear timeline if you decide to take legal action down the road." The idea of documenting everything made perfect sense. As I left Ben's office, I didn't feel lighter. I felt stronger. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't just reacting to my parents' manipulation. I had a strategy, and I was ready to fight for what was mine. The inheritance wasn't just money to me, it was my future, my independence, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away. That night, I grabbed a notebook and sat at my desk with a clear purpose. I started jotting down everything I could remember from the past few weeks. I'm officially done bending over backward for people who don't see my worth. This time, I'll be ready to meet them head on. But things escalated quickly. A few days later, I overheard my parents whispering in the kitchen. They were discussing how to convince me to help Tom. Something about combining the rent increase with a promise to revisit the inheritance later. It was clear they thought I was naive enough to fall for it. They didn't know I was already planning my next move. That evening, I started quietly packing my things. I didn't rush. I wanted to be methodical, careful not to raise suspicion. I tucked my packed boxes into my closet and started looking for a place to stay. Jake had already offered to help me out if I needed it, but I wanted to try finding my own space first. Within a week, I found a small apartment a few towns over that fit my budget. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I paid the deposit, signed the lease, and set a date to move in, all without breathing a word to my parents. The night before the move, my dad called a family meeting in the living room. I knew it wasn't going to be a discussion. It was going to be another ambush. Still, I played along, sitting on the couch while my parents and Tom positioned themselves like a united front. It was almost comical how obvious they were about it. "We've been thinking," my dad began, his voice carrying that faux authoritative tone he always used when trying to guilt-trip me. "This situation isn't working for anyone. We're a family, and families solve problems together. It's time for you to make a decision." I crossed my arms, keeping my expression neutral. "I already have. I'm not giving up my inheritance, and I'm not paying more rent." My mom sighed dramatically, like she'd just been told I didn't love her anymore. "You're being so stubborn. This isn't about money, it's about helping your brother, helping his kids. Do you even understand the kind of pressure we're under?" I was not paying any of their shit, so I reviled. "I'm moving out," I said plainly, leaning back in my chair. "I've already found a place, and I'll be gone by tomorrow." My mom's face went pale, and my dad's jaw tightened. "You're moving out?" My mom finally managed to ask, her voice trembling. "Where are you going to go? How can you afford this?" "I've already sorted it out," I replied, keeping my tone calm. "I have a lease signed and a plan in place." "But why would you leave?" she continued, her voice rising in pitch. "You don't need to go anywhere. You have everything you need here. This is your home." "No," I said firmly, meeting her gaze. "This stopped feeling like home a long time ago." Without waiting for a response, I walked to my room and closed the door. I could hear muffled voices behind me as they tried to process what had just happened, but I didn't care. This was my life, and I wasn't going to let anyone dictate how I lived it anymore. The next morning, I left before anyone was awake. As I drove away, I didn't feel regret or sadness. I felt free. Stick around for the next update. Things are far from over, and the real drama is just about to unfold. Update 2: It had been a couple of weeks since I moved out, and while I wasn't in college yet, I was finally able to think clearly and make plans for my future. I was saving every penny I could, preparing to enroll in the upcoming semester. A few weeks after I moved out, I thought things had finally settled. Sure, my parents still sent me guilt-tripping texts, but I ignored them. For once, I felt like I was in control of my life. But then, Tom's college situation came crashing down, dragging everyone back into chaos. It started with a call from Lisa, of all people. She rarely got involved in family drama, but her voice was tense when she called me one evening. "Have you heard about Tom?" she asked. "No," I said cautiously. "What now?" "He's been kicked out of college," she said flatly. "Apparently, he didn't meet the academic requirements again." I couldn't say I was surprised. Tom had been changing majors and coasting on half-hearted effort for years. "What are Mom and Dad doing about it?" I asked, already bracing for the answer. "They're scrambling," Lisa replied. "He's burned through his inheritance, so they're trying to figure out how to get him back in. I think they're planning to take out a loan to cover tuition." I sighed, shaking my head. "Of course they are. Why hold him accountable when they can just throw more money at the problem?" Lisa hesitated. "That's not all. They've been talking about you. Mom's convinced you'll change your mind and use your inheritance to pay for Tom's tuition. She thinks you just need a wake-up call to realize how important this is for the family." I laughed bitterly. "Unbelievable. They're still trying to drag me into this?" Lisa sighed. "You know how they are. They won't let it go." The next day, the guilt-tripping escalated. My mom called, her tone dripping with desperation. Tom is going through such a hard time, she began, skipping right over any pleasantries. He's trying so hard to turn things around, but the school won't give him another chance unless we pay up front for the next semester. I stayed silent, waiting for the inevitable. We were thinking, she continued, that you could help, just this once. Use some of your inheritance to cover his tuition, and we'll make sure he stays on track this time. It's the least you can do for your brother. No, I said firmly, cutting her off. That money is for my future, not to bail Tom out of his mistakes. Her tone shifted instantly, becoming colder. How can you be so selfish? He's your brother. He's trying to make something of himself, and you're just sitting on money you don't even need yet. I'm not selfish, Mom, I replied. I'm responsible. Something Tom could stand to learn. She hung up on me after that. Then Tom called, and his tone was even more desperate than usual. Look, I know I've screwed up, he started, but this is my last chance. I've found a program that's perfect for me. I just need a little help to get started. I cut him off. Tom, no. You've had plenty of chances. I'm not using my money to bail you out again. You're not even in college, he shouted, his frustration boiling over. You're sitting on that money for nothing while I'm trying to make something of myself. You're not trying, I snapped back. You're expecting everyone else to clean up your messes. I'm not doing it anymore. Then he muttered, You'll regret this, and hung up. A few days later, Lisa called again, this time with a warning. Mom and Dad went to the trustee overseeing your inheritance, she said. They're trying to convince them to release the money early. What? I said, my heart sinking. They can't do that. It's in trust. They're desperate, she said. But don't worry. It sounds like the school told them there's nothing they can do without your consent. I immediately called Ben, Jake's lawyer brother, to make sure everything was secure. He confirmed that the trust was airtight and advised me to keep documenting everything. If they try anything shady, you'll have the evidence to protect yourself, he said. Without access to my inheritance, my parents decided to co-sign a loan for Tom's tuition, putting themselves even deeper in debt. Meanwhile, Tom's academic career finally hit a dead end. The private program they enrolled him in dropped him after just one semester when he failed to meet their standards. Instead of holding him accountable, my parents doubled down on blaming me. They called, texted, and even sent letters, all variations of the same message. I'd abandoned the family. I ignored all of it. I wasn't going to let their poor decisions derail my life anymore. Months later, I finally enrolled in college, using my inheritance to cover tuition and living expenses. It felt like a fresh start, a chance to focus on my future without the weight of my family's expectations holding me back. As for Tom, he's still living with my parents, working a string of dead-end jobs and complaining about how life isn't fair. My parents continue to enable him, but their finances are stretched thin. They've made their choices, just like I've made mine. The next day, I called Ben, Jake's lawyer brother, and explained the situation. He immediately pulled up the trust documentation and contacted the trustee. A few hours later, he called me back, sounding serious. They tried to forge your signature, he said bluntly. The trustee flagged it right away. They submitted a request to access the funds, claiming it was on your behalf, but the paperwork didn't match up. The trustee reported it as fraudulent. I was stunned. Even though I knew my parents were desperate, I hadn't expected them to stoop this low. What happens now? The trustee filed a formal complaint, Ben said, and I forwarded the details to the proper authorities. If you want, you can let this play out legally, or we can try to settle it quietly. For a moment, I felt nothing but clarity. This wasn't a decision to be weighed. It was a line they had crossed, and there was no going back. No, I said firmly. They've made their choices. Let it play out. The situation escalated quickly. My parents were served with legal documents accusing them of attempting to commit fraud by forging my signature. They were forced to hire a lawyer, and the fines alone were substantial. I found out through Lisa that they dipped into their savings to pay the legal fees and were scrambling to cover the costs. Tom, of course, was furious. He called me one evening, ranting about how I'd betrayed the family. You didn't have to take it this far, he yelled. It's not like they were stealing it. They were just trying to help me. Trying to help you by committing fraud? I shot back. Do you even hear yourself, Tom? This is exactly why I had to leave. You and Mom and Dad think you're entitled to whatever you want no matter the cost. They're your parents, he shouted. They've done so much for you, and this is how you repay them? I didn't bother arguing. I'm done with this conversation, Tom. The fallout was brutal, for them at least. The court ultimately imposed a hefty fine on my parents and issued a formal warning that any further attempts to access the trust would lead to harsher penalties. They narrowly avoided criminal charges, But the financial hit was significant. Now my parents are left picking up the pieces. Their finances are in shambles. And Tom's college dreams are officially over. He's stuck in a dead-end job, still living at home, and still blaming everyone but himself. As for me, I finally enrolled in college, using my inheritance exactly as my grandfather intended. It feels like a fresh start, a chance to focus on my future without the weight of my family's expectations holding me back. I always keep reminding myself that I didn't choose this path. They did. By trying to manipulate and control me, they forced me to take a stand. And for the first time in my life, I'm proud of myself for doing just that. To everyone who's taken the time to read my story, thank you. If you're facing a similar struggle, remember this. It's not selfish to put yourself first. You deserve to be valued. And if the people around you can't respect your boundaries, it's okay to walk away and prioritize your own well-being. Sometimes, protecting your peace means choosing yourself.